Hello, everyone. This is the Free American Press with your host, Alexander Horat. And today we're joined by a freedom fighter from Canada, Ron Vaillant. And we're really excited to have you on the show, Ron.
Well, good. Thanks for reaching out. Glad you're doing what you're doing, especially as a young man. Had I been around with the internet at your age, I probably would have done the same thing.
If you enjoy our content and want to keep seeing amazing guests and insightful conversations, please like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support the channel directly, you can contribute through Zelle or Venmo. Every little bit helps me continue bringing you interesting guests and great content. Thank you so much for your support. Yeah, well, we definitely need more people to speak out on all these issues that are affecting us. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about what you're doing in Canada and some of the troubles that you've been facing?
Yeah, well, I started my channel in about 2018, and I did that because I knew I was coming down and I was trying to do my effort to help try and save our country, which unfortunately at this point in time, it's in the dumpster fire. But I definitely have put in my effort, and I ended up running in two federal elections because there was a new political party that had started. There's basically two parties that have controlled Canada, and that is the Conservatives and the Liberals. And the Conservatives, really, when you look at it, they're only conservative in name. They're really UN globalists when you look at what they're actually doing, right?
Yeah.
And actually, it was Brian Mulroney who signed on to UN Agenda 21 back in 1992, and then the other conservative, Stephen Harper, signed on to UN Agenda 2030 in 2015, and so then Trudeau was elected right after they signed that a document about a month later, and in about 2016, I thought the only hope for Canada was a benevolent military coup, you
Yeah.
know. But the whole thing is that it's all controlled all through when you see what's going on, when you get into the political system, you see all the filters that are all set up, and the only people who end up at the top are the ones who are supposed to be there by the globalists. And just think of the United States as an example. You have two political parties only, and it's such a huge filter that only those who are supposed to be there get to the top. And so that's the thing. And you can have it so that whether you vote left or right, it doesn't matter because they're both controlled at the top, and then it ends up being that you end up you think you have democracy, but you really don't. So anyhow, that's how it was in Canada, the Liberals and Conservatives. There's other parties as well, but they're all globalists as well.
Right.
The party, the PPC, People's Party of Canada, sounds communist, but it's not. That was started by a conservative MP or minister, and um, and then so finally I thought, well, there's hope for someone like myself to be able to run because there's no way I would last 2 minutes in any other party because I'm too outspoken, and
Yeah.
I'm not going to go ahead and go along to get along just for the sake of a paycheck, right? And so anyhow, that happened, and uh, it ended up being that it didn't go anywhere. The PPC, it still hasn't. It's had huge a movement and whatnot, but people are too afraid to vote for something alternative because of the fear of getting Trudeau back in back then, right? And so it goes on like that. And so it's very sophisticated the way they maneuver and do things. But yeah, so that's how that all started. And during that 2019 federal election, I'm from Alberta, which is the Texas of Canada. And we have one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and we supply probably close to 40% of US oil. So we're the Texas of Canada. And although we've had huge mass migration and immigration, and turned it to more liberal, and it's a kind of like the rural people are the conservatives, the people in the cities tend to be more liberal. But anyhow, so I noticed that there was, ever since I was a young man, there was a sentiment to have Alberta separate from Canada, and that was growing and building up until 2019, and that was one of the reasons for also running because I wanted to give Canada one last chance, and now it's coming to the point where there's going to be a vote for Alberta separation coming up soon,
Wow.
And there's quite a few people thinking about doing that. So anyhow, that is all that. But I ended up running in the 2019 federal election in northeastern BC. And my campaign manager told me about this document. It's called UNDRIP. Among other things, there's a Y to Y corridor as well, which is a big land grab. It's the Yellowstone to Yukon Wildlife Corridor, which starts from pretty much all of Idaho is part of it, part of that, most of BC, all the way through up into the Yukon there, and they want to make it a wildlife corridor, so that's an excuse
Uh,
to be able to just manage the land and get people off of the land. But anyhow, so I learned about this thing called UNDRIP, and it's United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that was a document that was created, fomented by the United Nations. It took over 20 years by their so-called experts, and so it's this fabricated thing of what they think should be the rights of the indigenous peoples, and it ended up being that there was someone else in the area who gave me this book because they were having another issue having to do with Indian issues. And but anyhow, so he kindly gave me the book. And so I was up there. I was up there for 3 months living out of my camper van. I was away from home all that time. It costs a lot of money to do that whole effort and whatnot. But so I was sitting there reading the book, and a lot of things you just would agree with. It's not that it's only a thin book. It's not very much. You can download it off the internet, but you start reading it, and it talks about the right to their heritage sites and to their cultural practices and all these other kinds of things. And you go, okay, sure, fine. But I came up to Article 26. There's 46 articles, and the whole book is so open-ended. It's just unbelievable. It's just a quagmire. But Article 26 states that the indigenous, and by the way, the book doesn't identify who the indigenous are. And the UN, I looked it up, and they didn't have an official, legal definition of what indigenous is, but they, you know, showed a video of someone's interpretation of what that is, right? But anyhow, so there's no definition, but it's all about the rights of the indigenous, this book. But Article 26 states that the indigenous have the right to the lands, territories, and resources to which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or used. So if you, let's say, have purchased a property from an Indian fellow, and then you own it, he can now, through this document, can go ahead and state, well, I own that before and I used it, so that's my land. I want to have right to it now. The thing is that the UN doesn't have any legal jurisdiction within countries. So what it takes is that for the politicians to go ahead and adopt it, and for the court system to do the same, right?
all right.
And so anyhow, with UNDRIP, the lens that you have to look at the whole document is through Article 26. And also Article 28 talks about restitution for the lands that have been used, right? So either you have to give it back, which is all a part of reconciliation. That's a big thing that's gone on in Canada here. And it's gone on in South Africa as well. They had, with apartheid, they did this whole thing of over 10 years, maybe 15 years of this reconciliation. And then finally, at the end, they said, we've had enough of reconciliation. Now is the time for justice. And that's where everything is going. You have to watch that buzzword of justice, social justice, environmental justice, etc.
All right.
And so then they went and they changed their constitution so that the blacks can go ahead and take the white farmers' land. And the white farmers and the white owners have about 70% ownership of the land, right? And
Yeah.
so there's been a slaughter going on over in South Africa that is not really talked about. I think Trump mentioned it, actually finally brought it up, and people got to know a little bit about it. But anyhow, so Article 26 and 28 are key in this whole UNDRIP document. And so what was happening in Canada, there was a bill, federal bill that was, in play actually, called Bill 262 by Romeo Saganash. He was a NDP. NDP is like, full-on communist type party,
Yeah.
But anyhow, they had this bill that about, having Canadian law be aligned to UNDRIP. But a bill, when an election is called, any bills or anything that's unresolved gets killed off, right? So that bill got killed off.
Mm.
But then I was given this document, and then I started reporting about how this is a really big deal, even though the bill got killed, right? So
Yeah.
then 3 days after the federal election in 2019, that was November, then or the end of October, um, then BC, British Columbia, which is a very far western province of Canada, their province adopted UNDRIP called, and they did the thing called DRIPA. And so they want to have everything aligned to this UN document, right? And this is the way the UN works. They try and work on a global level, they work on a federal, national level, they also work on a provincial or state level, all the way down to the municipal, right? And so if something doesn't grab here or there, then it can grab elsewhere, right? And that's basically what happened. So it didn't work federally at the time. So then British Columbia went ahead and did that. And I know a person whose family member was high up in the British Columbia government at the time in the election. And they said that that person has been working on files dealing with UNDRIP and all of this, but it's a gag order. They're not allowed to even talk to their family members about it. So all of this stuff is going on behind the scenes. And this is very important for you folks in the States because it's all going on behind the scenes in the States as well. We're just more advanced. We're the canary in the coal mine, right? But so all of a sudden, they go ahead and adopt DRIPA in 2019, and no one knows what in the world's going on, right? But I kept on, parroting, hey, this is a serious issue. This is going to change everything. And then with a new government installed, there was with that election, they had a thing called the throne speech. And that happened at the end of, let's see, uh, I'm trying to think 2020, I believe it was. Okay. And that's where the government talks about what they plan to do in the future. And so I was doing a video on it, recording it, and trying to find out all their buzzwords. And you have to know their buzzwords to know what's going on because it's all this double political speech. But in there, they did a one-liner calling, said that we're going to reintroduce UNDRIP, right?
Yeah.
And I did an emergency video and I got good traction. And then people reached out and we started to try and fight it. And so in 2021, that's when the bill came up. And so there's they introduced it into the House, or it'd be like the chamber or whatever in the States, I guess. And there's a first reading, and then people vote on it. They could kill it right there, or it could pass, and then they kind of amend it. It's amended. They go for a second reading, and then they go to standing committee. That's where other people like myself can go in and talk about it, right? And then there's a final vote. And when that happened, there was a standing committee, and right at that time, so that was around June of 2021, all of this, May, June. That's when I don't know if you heard about the story about all of these graves in British Columbia, Kamloops, where they talk about the residential schools and there was 215 dead children that were massacred there and all of that. And that story just surfaced right at that time. And the funny thing is I knew about that story or that narrative 20 years before, and it got resurfaced right at that time. So everyone was in an uproar about all this. And if anyone was to go and try and challenge this whole bill that they were having, you would actually meet a lot of resistance, and you're a
Yeah.
racist and all this kind of stuff. And the funny thing is that not one body has been dug up at that site, right? And actually, people have seen that it was probably more like a septic system. That's why there was the anomalies in that whole thing, right? So it's all just a made up story, and they're even making it so that one MP wanted to pass a law stating that if you deny the Kamloops grave story or any of that kind of thing, that you could go to jail for it, right?
Wow.
So that is still upcoming, but anyhow, that happened. And so this bill is called Bill C-15. And what it states is that all Canadian law has to be consistent with the declaration, which is defined as UNDRIP, right? So
Yeah.
now they've gone ahead and they've created a 176-point plan. I sent you the video there, and it was a second video on the videos. Maybe you could post these video links someplace so people can see them.
Yeah,
It's my
definitely.
playlist. I'm Ron Vaillant, and if you go on YouTube and search my name, you can look at the playlist and look at the UNDRIP playlist. It's the second video. But David Lamenti, he was a justice minister at the time. Yeah, if you go to playlists and then UNDRIP, well, actually, Agenda 21 and 2030 is the first thing you should watch, one or two of those videos, just so you get the big picture, because that's the umbrella in which everything sits under. But UNDRIP, the takeover, if you click on that, it'll just
How
pull up
many
that
here
first
know that you're
video.
going to lose your?
That's where I'm talking. But the second video is called Undo Colonialism. And that, and
We
in
use.
these videos like that, all that writing I added on to it, right? But he's the justice minister. Everything is going to justice. The fact that he is involved in all of this whole thing of implementing UNDRIP in Canada all has to do with justice. So it's no coincidence that the justice minister is doing this. But at the end of the video, they talk about how undoing 150 years of colonialism is more than the mandate of one government. So this whole colonialism thing, like if you think about it, if no one had come into Canada at all and it was just the natives who were living here, they would still probably be living in, the Stone Age. It's just because, Europe brought about, thousands of years of technology and resources that they just simply didn't have, right? They were doing metallurgy and all kinds of things that, are far beyond what the natives were doing. And so everything, the roads, the infrastructure, the cities, all of this stuff, all of this industrialization is colonialism. And if you go and understand about UN Agenda 21 and 2030, they want to undo industrialization because it's this industrialization that is destroying the earth and causing all of this climate change. It used to be actually, it's kind of a funny story. Back in about 1974, when I was in junior high school, I guess you guys call it middle school, I think, I don't know. But anyhow, the science teacher was talking about how from the 1950s all the way to the 1970s, the earth has been cooling and we're going into a new ice age and we're all going to die of an ice age. And, I had my little BS meter, right? And it's kind of, is, just learning, right? But I didn't believe what he was saying. But then I thought, oh man, we're all going to die. That's terrible. And we only had it one time that we heard that, and it still affected me at the time when I heard it, right? I thought, oh, kind of scary. But all these kids are hearing this continually that the earth is warming and you're going to die from it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a narrative, and the narrative that where the science teacher got it is the same people which are now have changed it because in the 1980s it completely flipped around. Now it's global warming, right?
Yeah.
And the narrative was, if we don't avert this global warming by the year 2000, it'll be irreversible and we're going to end up having all kinds of problems and stuff, right? And so that happened, and so this whole narrative is all tied in. It's this climate change. They changed it to climate change because, global warming really wasn't, that well proven, I guess. And so now there's this whole climate change agenda that they have. And when you think about it, it all is based on CO2, right?
Right.
Man-made CO2 is causing the destruction of the earth. So in order to be able to save the earth, we have to manage all of the CO2. And everything that we do as humans has to do with CO2. We exhale CO2 even, and um, and when you think about it, the whole issue of CO2 is just ridiculous because if you think about how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, it's like, 0.038%, and then the amount of man-made CO2 is another 0.038% of that whole amount. So you could have a couple of volcanoes go off and it'll produce more CO2 than all of mankind, combined. And so all of this is just a ruse, a con to be able to say, okay, we have to control everything. We have to control people's activities, what they do, and whatnot. So this is where we're at. So all of this is tied into the big picture of UN Agenda 2030 and UN Agenda 21. And so UNDRIP is kind of a part of that, and it all kind of ties into um, you have the World Economic Forum, which actually is working with the UN to achieve UN Agenda 2030. And on their website, they posted a video, and everyone's probably heard of the slogan that by 2030 you'll own nothing, right?
Yeah.
Right? And that is where they want to take us. And so all of these things are just kind of con jobs to be able to strip us of our property rights and our ability to earn income and whatnot, right? And so this whole UNDRIP thing is another salvo, an attack angle to be able to take, if the property, the land that you're living on is no longer yours and you are a settler or a renter on someone else's land, um, the idea of wanting to, forward yourself very much it gets taken away because anything you build on it can be taken away at a moment's notice, right? And okay, so anyhow, so I was yelling from the mountaintops about this whole thing, and I think it was around 2021 there was an article that came up, and this is before the Bill C-15 passed. It might even been 2020, and that's Campbell River Mirror article, and there was a lawyer who represented the Indians, and he said British Columbians are in for a real shock when most of the province will be given to the Indians, right?
Wow.
And okay, so that was the first thing that could say, well, because other people were just saying, oh, Ron's just exaggerating, it's just too big of a thing to kind of grasp that maybe you might end up losing your land rights here, right? And we have limited land rights in Canada as it is. We don't really have them per se, but it's a lot better than having someone else having title of your land that you paid for, right? At
Yeah.
least in our
Exactly.
system now, we can have our own title, but the government can take it away at any time. And in the United States, actually, it's happening. Oklahoma, if you go look up Oklahoma, you'll find that half of Oklahoma has been claimed by the Indians as well. This is going on in the States as well. If you go look up Oklahoma, half of Oklahoma has been claimed because they say that it's an Indian reserve. And the way that works, and this is the reason why a lot of land is being claimed in Canada, it's a thing called the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Okay, and that was when the King of England, when the settlers were coming, he was stating that he doesn't want any of the settlers or any entities to go and make any land deals with the Indians east of the Appalachian Mountains. And the reason he said that was because they wanted to claim it all, right?
Yeah.
And and so it was like an internal memo, really, right? Just saying, hey, you guys, like don't do that. It'll be problematic for you if you do, right? But basically in Canada, what they're saying is that royal proclamation is stating that all of this land is an Indian reserve, and they say that this is our title to it now because it's an Indian reserve. And I think in the United States, that's probably how it's going to go as well. So that's something you want to be able to keep your ears attuned to, the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Um, and in that playlist, there's a couple of videos as well. One is the Oscars, 2024 Oscars, where they did a land acknowledgement. They started off the Oscars and say, we acknowledge that we're on Indian land, right? And that's how it starts. That is the very front of it. And so anytime there's any kind of land acknowledgement, that's basically kind of a land claim. And I found out about that in 2019 in the federal election because I started hearing it in BC. And BC was always far ahead of anywhere else in Canada regarding the Indian issues because there's always Indian problems up there, right? And issues. And um, so I was going up there, and then they would start a meeting, and they acknowledge that they're on Indian land. And this is, a mayor of a town saying this, right? And I go, what?
Yeah.
And so you're acknowledging you're on Indian land, and then after the federal election, I came back to Alberta to the very first separationist meeting. There's about 700 people there at this bar. And a guy goes up there and he is actually ex-military and he has this YouTube channel talking about, separating and everything else like that. But he starts off and he says, I want to thank the Indians of the Treaty 6 territory for allowing us and inviting us on their land to be able to do our meeting. And this is right in the city of Edmonton,
Wow.
the Edmonton Oilers, or the Calgary Flames. These are, in hockey, these are the two big cities in Alberta. And so what? He's doing this. And I went to him afterwards. I said, who told you to do that? He says, oh, no one told me to do that, And I said, oh yeah, for sure. You're not just doing this on your own. So that's where it starts, and it's everywhere now. You go to any kind of major meeting in Canada, and even in the NHL, the Oilers, if you watch the Oilers, sometimes they'll start their whole ceremony acknowledging they're on Indian land.
Wow.
And so these things will be used in a court of law because if you have mayors and you have all these institutions saying that we're on Indian land, you know, then they can go into UNDRIP Article 26 and they say, this is our land. Even the people are saying it, all these people, right? So it can be used in legal cases, but it's also an indoctrination thing, to make everyone feel guilty that, hey, we're on Indian land. We don't even own our own land anymore, that kind of a thing. And so there is a video there for the United States talking about, acknowledging that in the Oscars that they're on Indian land. And then there's a TED talk talking about how it would be better if the land was given back to the Indians because they could be better stewards of the land. And that's a whole nother angle to this whole thing is that, um, you know, if you can actually have the Indians be the stewards of the land, then you won't have all this industrialization and this colonialism, right?
Yeah. Uh, can you tell the viewers what exactly UNDRIP stands for? The name?
United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Well, I guess a good question is, so once the Indians get this land back, are they allowed to develop it, or is there no development allowed once they get the land back?
Well, that's the whole thing. I mean, first of all, is to get the land, and that's in Canada. All of Canada is being claimed or has been claimed now. And it's starting to really bubble to the surface because in British Columbia, I did a video actually, it's in the playlist about how the city of Vancouver, which is a fairly major city, one of the most costliest cities for real estate in North America, actually. All of that, the city council says that three Indian bands are the rights and title holders to this, and they cite the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And I thought, well, they're just city council. That doesn't mean anything. But they're basically saying that because the courts have made different decisions. And so that's why they've come up with this conclusion. And no one in Vancouver knows about this. And so I did a video talking about their UNDRIP strategy plan and how they want to co-govern. They want to be able to co-revenue, get revenue from people's taxes. And that's a thing now, there's a thing, where you can actually do voluntary payment for being on Indian land, that's being pushed and whatnot. And so there's this whole thing of this UNDRIP strategy plan. And and then recently what has happened is that a land case, some Indians who are from Vancouver Island, which is an island separate from Vancouver City, which is on the mainland, they claimed a section of Richmond, which is a city, and it's a fairly big land claim. And the BC Supreme Court has said that, basically, yeah, that's their land. And so now it's starting to bubble to the surface where people are going, oh my goodness, what does this mean for all of Canada, right? And so it's starting to bubble to the surface. Now the thing is, if the whole concept is that the Indians were here first, we came and that we stole their land, and now this whole thing that really it's their land and not ours. And so with that whole narrative, if you're in someone else's house, they can just tell you to leave whenever they want. If you're on someone else's land, the same can happen as well. And an example of this is there's a lady named Tanya Gaw. She's a real activist in Canada, and her website or her movement is called Action for Canada, the number four. And she learned about this whole UNDRIP thing through me, and then she ended up going to Vancouver Island, and trying to think of the town now, but she went up there and she was going to do a whole series on UNDRIP. And then the Indian chief up there, he said, he put pressure on the venue that they don't allow this meeting to happen. And then they shut down, they decided not to go ahead and do it. It's too much pressure. But
Wow.
Tanya was able to get another venue, but then the chief said, you're not allowed, you're not welcome in our territory, right? And
Yeah.
that's where this is going. So if they don't like you, they can just say, you're not welcome in our territory. And the
Wow.
same thing happened to a full-blooded Indian. We had the big trucker convoy that everyone heard about, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay. And there's actually two trucker convoys. There's one before that that's the reason why the second one was so big. But anyhow, he goes over to Ottawa and he is outspoken about UNDRIP as well, like me. And then an Indian chief over there told him, a full-blooded Indian, you're not welcome in our territory, right?
So
And
when they
so
when they
now it doesn't have any teeth, but down the road it will. And so this is a super big issue, this whole UNDRIP thing. And so yeah, they with this TED talk, this is talking about the United States and California actually. She was just saying that it'd be better if the Indians had the land because they're better stewards of the land, because they're basically living in, they were living in the Stone Age. She doesn't say that, but, there is no industrial development with them, right? There's no pipelines and all these other things that are so horrendous. But, um, and so the Indians, they have a belief system that North America they call it Turtle Island. They believe it's a turtle. Okay, it's a living organism. And so if you do anything to the turtle, you're harming it. So if you put a dam on a river, you're cutting off its, veins and arteries, from free flowing, right?
Mm.
Or if you go and do a mining project, you're messing with its nervous system and whatnot. And so the way it's going to go is that they're going to give the Indians the land in Canada for sure. There's nothing stopping it in Canada. And the United States, I don't know how far it's going to go. It depends on you guys,
Yeah.
um, but they will get the land, the rights and titles of the land, and then they will also be given, stewardship of the land as well. And this because that we're on their land, it's also going to be co-governance. Everything's going to be 50-50. Everything is going to have to go through Indian approval, right? And another example of this whole thing is that I have friends who live in BC and they moved and they bought a property, 80-acre parcel, and they showed me a picture of it. And there's this big bridge going to it. It's a private bridge. It was like 80 feet long going over a river. And the previous owner had built this bridge. And I'm in construction. I'm a journeyman carpenter and journeyman pipe fitter, and I'm a tradesman. And to build an 80-foot bridge over a river is a real, you know, achievement for an individual to do, right? So anyhow, they have this bridge, and I says, I don't like that bridge. But anyhow, so they bought the property, and then a few years later, the bridge is on Crown land. It's the same thing as it'd be like BLM land in the States,
Yeah.
government land, right? And so they had a 10-year lease. Every 10 years, they had to renew the lease for this bridge being on this Crown land. So in 2022, the government says, okay, you got to renew your lease, but we have new stipulations. You're going to have to go and get uh, public insurance in case anyone jumps off the bridge or hurts himself on the bridge. That was going to be expensive. Plus, you have to put $100,000 deposit, in case we have to take down the bridge. And they were willing to do that because, I mean, that's a bridge to their property. They can get access to the property, but it takes another way, but it takes 15 minutes, detour.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so they're willing to do it, but then the bureaucrat who probably hasn't built a paper plane in his entire life, let alone a bridge, he says, yeah, but we can only go ahead and give you an 8-year lease because by 2030, there's that year again, right? By 2030, we're going to be giving back the all the crown land to the Indians, and we want to give it back in pristine condition. That means uncolonized. So that means the bridge is going to come down anyhow. So they didn't want to go and put 100 grand down on this, taking down the bridge or to have the bridge for all those 8 years and just have it. So they said, no, we're not going to renew it. And then that bureaucrat, and this is the problem this is the whole problem, is the reason why communism takes over countries and everything else is that people go along to get along. They don't stand up, they don't fight it, you know. He didn't fight it in some kind of covert way and try and keep the bridge there, but say it was gone, or something, right? Something, some kind of, subversion or something to do, to fight it. He just goes along and then they go and tear down that bridge. And it's not this their bridge. They're taking down bridges all over in the backcountry, even in Alberta and other places. And so it's all about giving the land back in pristine, uncolonized condition. And all of this has to go back to UN Agenda 21, where they want to deindustrialize, the West, basically. And all of that has to do, the reason why they want to deindustrialize us, or like the World Economic Forum says, by 2030 you'll own nothing, is that if we're so broke and poor and just surviving in these AI run cities, smart cities, then we cannot mount a good resistance to it, right? And the goal is to be able to have a global government. It's a new world order. It's the UN running the show basically at the top, right? And the UN is just another front group, just like the World Economic Forum, but that's where it's going to a pyramidal system of power. And that's exactly what Hitler did when he gained into power in 1933. If you go and study what happened, all these laws were made so that he consolidated power. And that's exactly what's going on in the United States right now with Trump too, actually. So people need to open their eyes. But
So, so you think Trump is consolidating power right now and getting
well,
ready
that's what's going on. You also got military in the streets now, of all things. You got the uh, what are they called? The reserves. The reserves are in the streets to deal with and it's a good excuse, that people will buy. We got to get rid of all of these illegals that came into our country, right? The illegals were all brought into United States by the UN. The UN was helping, aiding and abetting them all along their journey,
right?
and then, the border is loose and everything else like that. And now, okay, so you got problem, reaction, solution. Problem, you got all these illegals coming into the country. Oh no, we got a problem. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to go and put military in the streets to deal with this. And people say, yeah, we got to save our country. We got to be able to get rid of all these illegals. Meanwhile, they're buying, the con. The con is now you got everyone's being acclimated to having military in the streets. And United States, it's always been that you don't have the military in the streets, right? So
Yeah.
anyhow, no, it's consolidation of power. You just keep your eyes open and you watch what's happening, and that's what's going on. So anyhow, it's all of this is happening, and
I guess the question for everybody is how can we protect our own private property? What can we do to stop this?
well, the thing is to get educated as to what's going on because it's all done behind the scenes. And it's still in Canada, most people have no clue what's going on, but they're seeing it's bubble to the surface now and they're kind of going, what's up? But it's so far along now that and the thing in Canada is that once you make a land deal, it's protected by the Constitution. You can't change it unless you change the Constitution. So it's a big deal. And so in the United States, it's going to also be done through the whole issue of the black issue, like the black people. Um, you know, for lack of a better word. I mean, I'm not racist in any way. I know what's going on with this whole thing, and what they want to do is they want to have reparations to the fact that there was this whole slavery issue and all of that stuff that went on. So that's another angle that's going to be a big thing, probably maybe more predominant than because in California they're talking about doing reparation payments, for this whole black slavery issue
Yeah.
and and so that's going to be an issue too. But um, to be able to get educated, so go in the playlist, try and get your head wrapped around a little bit of what's going on there, and then take a look in your own state, your own government, and look around for is the state talking about UNDRIP in any way? Are they talking about land acknowledgements? Are you seeing those things come up? Whenever you see land acknowledgements, it's full on, it's going forward. And And then from there, really the thing is, it's the politicians that are doing it. It's the politicians and the courts, actually. Um, uh, and these things like have been going on in Canada for a long time. Um, we have the Supreme Court, just like you have a Supreme Court for your country. And the Supreme Court has been making decisions about Indian issues using UNDRIP for a long time now, even before Bill C-15 happened. And that all has to do with previous UN different things that have passed that we don't even know about that make it so that they have to go in a certain direction, right? And so that's where you want to start looking at that. But so it's the politicians who bring this upon us and the courts. So uh, what you have to do is you have to be able to educate, the people who are in power as to what's going on, and let them know that if you go along to get along here, you're just going to end up, destroying it for your own family too and your friends, right? An example of this is that when Bill C-15 was going on and it was in the House of Commons and they were voting and they were going through this whole thing. At the time of the standing committee, we had organized to have Zoom meetings with two conservative MPs, the so-called conservatives, right? And there's two conservatives on that standing committee, and they were supposed to be protecting us, right? So one who is from Alberta, we had a Zoom meeting with them, and I said, Arnold, this is probably the most important bill in Canadian history because everything is going to change, and
Yeah.
I don't see you saying anything at all about it on your social media or your YouTube channel. And then his answer was, yeah, but some things are better left unsaid. The most important thing in Canadian history probably is better left unsaid. And he was giving an honest answer because he knows that if he was to stand up or say anything about it, he would get shot out of the party. He would lose, he would run as an independent, until, the next election, but he would most likely not be reelected. So he has to, sit down and shut up, right? And the thing is that he did not even leak the story. He did not even, try and, through, some kind of clandestine means to be able to get it out to reporters so they could report on it. Just no, sit down and shut up, and let it go. And then the other conservative, MP, he actually was the vice chairman of that whole committee. And when they started the whole committee, they started off saying that we acknowledge we're on Indian land.
Yeah.
And these guys don't challenge it or say boo or anything. They're just going along with it. And they don't warn the people or nothing. And so he made a statement, something like, it's a shame that no one knows about UNDRIP. And I says, well, that's on you. You're the official opposition, that's your job, And he says, yeah, but we need help, he said. But that was just an excuse because to this day, neither him or any other so-called conservative MP has given any warning to Canadians. They don't know what's going on whatsoever. And that's because they go along with the whole program because they're UN globalist run as well. They know they can't talk about it, right? And um, so if you start seeing land acknowledgements, you need to start educating people about that. And your politicians, uh, they're going to vote on these things. Now in Canada, it's kind of, you got the federal government, then you got the provincial government, and then you got counties. And I'm sure you have counties down in the States too. And I thought, okay, I'll try and get, it already had passed Bill C-15. All the MPs on the federal level, they're just going to go along with it. There's no hope there, basically. So, and then our province is actually implementing UNDRIP as well. And then I thought, okay, well, that's kind of, tough too. So maybe on the county level, we could go ahead and we could educate the counties. So I did that with our county and adjoining counties. And in talking to them, uh, I asked, because what it is that Canada is a corporation, and so is the province of Alberta. It's a corporation, a registered corporation. And
No, that's true. Yeah.
the counties are sub corporations to the Alberta Corporation. And so when I was talking to one of the counselors about it, I asked that question. They said, yes, we are a sub corporation to the Alberta Corporation. And so what that means is that the Alberta Corporation or the Alberta politicians, they can actually spit out any kind of councillors or mayors or anything down on the lower levels, you know. And that has been proven. There was a situation in a small town called Chestermere, and the town mayor and some councillors got elected, and they were trying to clean up house because it was so corrupt and everything else. And then it ended up being that on the Alberta level, that a minister went ahead and he turfed the town mayor and some councillors and spit them out of there. So it shows you where, you know, that is. So in Alberta, as an example, we have to get the provincial level, they're called MLAs. We have to get them to be able to get educated and rise up and fight it, you know. And so I don't know how it works in the states. You know, it's probably very similar to the same thing where on the state level, they have power over the counties in some way. So,
Yeah.
but anyhow, so these people have to be educated, and the problem is that it's hard to when you're so far ahead of the curve and you start talking about this stuff, it just, you know, it just flies over people's heads and they just can't believe it, right? But there's so many things happening in Canada that you can now point to that actually, you know, can say, well, hey, this is really going on. And it's also going on in Australia, it's going on in New Zealand, and it's basically going on in most of the colonized countries, right, including the United States. As an example, there is a fellow, his channel is called Crossing the Rubicon, and he's in New Zealand. And I posted his video on the channel because he was speaking up about UNDRIP in New Zealand, the Maori Indians, right? And how they're given all this power and stuff like that. And UNDRIP is being implemented. And it ended up being that he was having good traction, I guess, because they went ahead and they put him on the news, how he's a racist and how he's causing all this division in the country and everything else like that. And he became toxic waste. And then to the
Wow.
point where he lost his job, you know, because I mean, you know, if you have someone like that, you know, high profile now who's working for you, and you know, it's just it drags down your company as well. It makes you look bad, right? Unless you're willing to stand up as well. And most people aren't, it seems. And so he loses his job and then he loses his marriage. And then a year later he puts another video out, you know, slamming UNDRIP again, but in there he's talking about how his life has been destroyed basically, you know, for having
Wow.
spoken out. And that's why people don't speak up because they, you know, there's a price to pay, right?
Yeah, it's definitely true. Uh, so do you think their plan is just to de-industrialize the West and lower the population? And why do you think they're doing this? Why do you think that's their goal?
Well, it's just another salvo in a multi-pronged attack because we're facing basically a globalist mafia, the likes of which you can't believe. And the power and control system is so huge, and it goes through all these different secret societies and all these people, they end up, you know, getting their marching orders and it's all in high places, you know. Like when you see what happens in politics, like I was mentioning before about this big filter, like even in Alberta, when you see what goes on behind the scenes, there's been some independent minded political parties, right? And and there's the one that's running it, and they're basically they're going along with the UN globalist agenda. Okay, so they're being controlled obviously in some way or manner. And these other independent parties, they you know they have you know different ideas and they could be a danger, right? And so these parties end up becoming taken over, co-opted, or destroyed in one way or another. And it's too much to go into. But it ends up being that, you know, you end up in a situation where only the people that they want at the top are there. And so this is the same in the States as well. And you have to watch that. And so what was the question again? Sorry, there was about
Oh, I
getting
just I just
the land
asked
and
you.
everything. Yeah. So the thing is that if the Indians are able to claim all the land, and maybe in the States it might be the Indians and the blacks. I'm not too sure how that's going to go. That's a whole different angle there with the black community, right? But but that is definitely in play, and that's you know something to look at. But if you're on someone else's land, I mean, they call the shots. It's just the way it is. I mean, And so it's a really a kind of a wild play. I never would have thought that we would see something like this because they obviously have an end game of how they wanted to tie the knot and make it all work, right? But it's a little bit vague at this point in time how all of that is going to fully work. But yeah, so they will be able to, call the shots. And the thing is that if they are given the environment to take care of, and they start shutting down all and deindustrializing everything, what it ends up being is that they become the scapegoat. So instead of the UN being the bad guy, it's now all of a sudden all these Indian bands who are basically told, we got to shut down these different things, in order to grease your palms and keep the money coming and everything else, you got to go ahead and do this. And now all of a sudden, we have this deindustrialization. And that's exactly what's in that second video. They want to decolonize Canada. Think what that means. And then my friends lose their bridge because they want to decolonize, and so it's a dismantling of our systems of the ability to be able to earn a living and be self-supporting. And that's a whole nother thing with the UN is that owning your own place, your own land is not sustainable. It all has to do with sustainable development.
Yeah.
And so this is all going to be used as an excuse to be able to forward those means, right?
And you said that you ran for political office, right?
Right.
Could you tell the viewers a little bit how that process went, what you learned, some things that you saw when you did that?
Well, that's where I learned about UNDRIP and I learned about the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. I learned about like the fellow who was having Indian problems where his acreage was, it was all kind of surrounded by Crown land, the whole subdivision, right? And that whole subdivision was being claimed by the Indians because going back, when they were, making treaties and everything else like that, because that was Treaty 8 territory up in northern BC. Most of BC doesn't have treaties, it's unceded land. So they're in a different situation, but that's Treaty 8. And so it was during the conservative government, and they actually went and did this thing. And so they're saying that when they made the treaty was that they would cede or they would give up the land, land claims to all of that whole area in exchange for 120 acres of reserve land, or they could take it privately, right? So this is where the reserve system came in. And so what was the whole deal was is that they're saying that when they did a census count back then, that they didn't count all the Indians because others were out trapping and hunting and everything else like that. So they come up with this new fictitious number of, for this blueberry band, that there's another 100 Indians who were, back then who weren't accounted for. And now they are going to be given 120 acres now for this whole thing, right? So it's just another land grab issue. And the blueberry band was quite far north of the nearest city of Fort St. John. And but they were claiming the land that was closer to Fort St. John, where everyone from Fort St. John, which is 20, the land is 20 minutes out of that city, where they would go as Crown land, they would go, hunting or fishing or quadding or, getting out into nature, right? But so this blueberry band was claiming all of that land on account of this whole new thing, of saying that we miscounted when we did the treaties, right?
Yeah.
And it's just another land grab thing, and they want to be able to make it so that um, all of all of these small communities won't be able to survive, and another thing that was going on basically was in northern BC was a thing. What was it now? Oh yeah, it has to do with the caribou. Okay, I did a whole video on that, and the excuse is that the caribou numbers are going down in northern BC on account of colonization and industrialization, right? And so at the beginning of 2019, they were going to all these small towns in northern BC, and they were saying, we're going to do this caribou recovery, okay? And 1 to 3 million acres of land in northern BC is going to become off limits for development in order to save the caribou herd, which is just a joke because The caribou aren't spread over 3 million acres of land. They go into this, select little pockets of where they go, right?
Yeah.
And any kind of development, if you drill an oil well, that's not killing any caribous. So
Mm.
anyhow, all of these towns were in an uproar over this whole thing, and if they had a meeting and everyone would show up, and so I was speaking out about that, this caribou recovery and the con job that it was, and I go through the whole document of it, and the whole reason for the caribou recovery is so that you can bring up the caribou herds to the ancestral harvesting numbers, back 200 years ago, for the Indians to shoot, and kill so it's just ridiculous, right? And so it ended up being that that whole thing passed, and 2 million acres of land is off limits. And even back then, people were talking about they'd go into the back country and signs were put up, they were saying that you cannot go beyond this point, right? And uh, and so that's going on in full swing. And so these small little towns, they're resource development towns. I mean, that's how they survive. The forestry or oil and gas, coal, these kinds of things. And so if you cannot go and do any more, you know, harvesting of these things, well, then the small towns die. And another way they're killing the small towns is that they are shutting down, small little hospitals and clinics, and so people have to go a huge long ways in order to be able to, have any kind of really good medical treatment. And if you go into all across Canada, these towns are spread out far from each other,
Yeah.
and anyhow, so that's what's been going on. And so all of these things are going on behind the scenes at different attack angles, and it's all has to do with getting people to get off the land, to be self-dependent, right? And I remember back in the 80s, I was hearing about this going on in the United States. There's different things going on to destroy the small farmer. And
Yeah.
so this has been
True.
going on for 40 years in the United States as well, various different things. And so they want to be able to bring you and force you into the bigger centers in which they can control a lot better with their smart cities. And that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And these smart cities are definitely scary. So I'm sharing the screen again to show your channel of how people can find you. Is there anywhere else that you'd like people to find you and find your work?
Okay, yeah. It started off as kind of like a Save Canada political channel. And after the two federal elections, I ran in, or even after the first one, I basically, uh, went more freestyle. So there's things on there that are a bit radical, and very on the edge of things. But I'm willing to post those things for consideration because this is how I've been all through my life. Is to consider, even the crazy stuff, right? And the crazy stuff, can be just crazy and just out there and not true, or it can actually be part of something else. And so I share little tidbits here and there, and to help people maybe connect the dots for themselves, and all these other kinds of right there. If you just go up a bit, one more, right there. This is actually stop. It says Olds, Alberta. Okay, that one is actually in the playlist. That's where I do like a speech. It's in about 300 people showed up as a small town, and I talk about this whole topic. And so it's in the playlist. If you go to the playlist, you'll be able to come up with a lot of that information. Anyhow, so I'm willing to go on to the fringes of things and look at different possibilities because generally speaking, and I'm not trying to brag or anything, but I've generally been about 20 years ahead of the curve for the average person on the street, and that's just simply because when you know what's going on, you see that these timelines are well advanced over above what people know, right? And so it is that way. And so if I start sharing stuff that you think is just totally out there, just think, well, maybe, file it in the back, the filing cabinet and say, well, okay, that's crazy stuff, but okay, we'll just keep an eye out to see if any of that stuff develops, or if, things prove it wrong. And that's another thing too, because for me, like truth is truth, right? And truth can go up to any kind of scrutiny. And so everything in my thinking, if I have certain, conclusions that I've kind of come to over the years, if there's new information that totally blows it out of the water and is conclusive, on many different levels, well, then I have to change my mind and I'm willing to do that and go another direction, right? And so that's that, I
Yeah,
guess.
definitely. So, is there anything else you'd like to add, Ron, before we end the video?
Well, I mean, big things are happening, and I became a Christian in 1984, and that's when I asked, for wisdom to be able to see what's going down, right? And I applied myself to it all these years, and um, and really, I think what's happening is when you look what's happening is we're about to see something really radical happen in the future, and it's not too far distant because they've been trying to merge all the churches, all the religions together, right? It's called ecumenism, and there's the Abrahamic Accord. Even Trump talks about the Abrahamic Accord, trying to get, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity to be all buddies and stuff like that. And we're all leading up to a point where in order to be able to wrap the entire world into one big happy family and one kind of total mindset, I can see that a big event is going to happen. It might be like, Ronald Reagan said, hey, if we had an alien invasion, that we would all come together, to fight
Right.
at this common enemy, right? So it might involve some kind of crazy stuff like that, or it might even be like people are talking about a new age Christ. If you go and look at not the video I just posted today, but the previous last week's video, you'll see that the people who are involved in the UN with Alice Bailey and whatnot, they're talking about the appearance of a new age Christ, right? And
Yeah.
so this will be like a second coming, and everyone, all these religions, and everyone's going to say, "Oh, this is Jesus Christ," this coming the second time, but it won't be. It'll be a fake one, and so I think that people need to. Well, ultimately the best preparation for all of this is to get right with God yourself, to ask for that born again experience that Jesus talked about in John chapter 3, and as a light is brought upon your path to walk in it, and do everything that within your power to do, your walk with God, right? And leave the rest to God. And so what we're seeing ultimately, I think, are biblical events. And so it's going to take, you know, God leading us and guiding us through all the maze and all the different traps that are going to be coming down upon us, because they want to be able to consolidate the entire world into one groupthink for the common good. That's another buzzword, the common good, right? And so individualism has to go, and all of the stuff is, living off your own land, being independent, all that is very rugged individualism. And so all of that has to be dismantled, taken away, and everyone has to be brought into the common community of the AI cities for the common good, right? And we saw that with COVID. If you had a different opinion about what the narrative was, you were ostracized, and all of it had to do with the common good. And so you had to go along to get along for that, and that's where we're all headed. So UN Agenda 2030, they have big goals. And if understand what those goals are, then you'll realize that we have like just 4 years for them to realize those goals. So I think radical events are about to happen. And that's one of the reasons why I ran in 2019, because I knew this Agenda 2030 was in play. And there's only one thing that could have stopped it, and that was us with the PPC, because all the other parties are all UN globalists, and they're forwarding it. And so um, after that federal election and our failure of not being able to take power, I said there's nothing stopping. It's like the Starship Enterprise, and the shields are down and the Klingons are coming in, and they're just having their way with the Starship Enterprise, just blowing it to bits. And that's basically what's happening. We're witnessing that right now in mass.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I'm thankful there's people like you who are trying to expose what's going on. and the People's Party of Canada. That's great that they're trying to stop what's going on. And I would just like to thank you again, Ron, for coming on my
Okay, well,
channel and explaining all this to us. And I hope we can have you on the channel again soon.
all right. Well, thank you for your work, and you're young, so you got lots of years ahead of you to forward this work.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you,
And
Ron.
thank you for being brave enough to cover, such radical topics because, you can easily become called a racist and, all these different derogatory terms, just to shut you down. But, when the heat comes, just stay true, true and blue.
Yeah, I agree. That's what we need to
I
do.
guess blue in the States is Democrats.
Yeah,
In Canada, the blue stands for the Conservatives, but I understand the Ten Commandments are probably written on blue marble. So true and blue.
yeah, that's good. That's always good.
Okay.
Well, thanks again, Ron. Thank you
Okay.
for
All
everybody
right. Best to
watching.
you. Thank you.
Please subscribe.